the leaves have changed colors and the jack-o'-lanterns find their way onto doorsteps. Everybody's getting their costumes ready and gearing up for the onslaught of trick-or-treaters because at the end of the month, the sacred holiday of Halloween shall soon be upon us. Or at least that's how it would normally go, but 2020 has been weird and bad, and that likely means that for most of us, Halloween is going to look completely different this year. While it's genuinely not a good idea to go out and watch horror movies with your friends and attend cool costume parties like usual, that doesn't mean the spooky fun of the season has to be lost. Being a fan of horror games is, in a lot of ways, a double-edged sword. Horror is one of the hardest genres to get right because getting just one design detail even slightly wrong will inevitably cause your game's scariness to give way to either hilarity or frustration, neither of which are really ideal for a game that's trying to invoke fear. For this reason, many smaller studios that jump on horror don't exactly stick the landing, but don't worry, I'm here to tell you about 10 horror or horror-adjacent games on the Switch that you might not have given a shot, and can potentially liven up your cold October nights with some much-needed anxiety. Now, I'm mainly going to focus on smaller indie titles for this list, but it is worth noting that a lot of bigger-name horror games are also available on Switch at this time. For instance, almost all of the mainline Resident Evil series is on the platform, as well as the Five Nights at Freddy's series, and while I'm not personally a huge fan of them, both games in the Outlast series are also available on Switch. If you're more interested in horror action than typical horror, you can find most of the Doom franchise on Switch as well. If multiplayer is more your thing, you should check out Dead by Daylight, where you can play as or run away from my boys Michael Myers and Pyramid Head, among others, and there's even kid-friendly and cartoony horror to be found in Nintendo's own Luigi's Mansion 3. So with all of that out of the way, I want to talk about some smaller titles you might not have played yet. So let's turn out the lights and really get into the meat of this thing. Speaking of meat, CARRION is a weird place to start with this list, as it's a horror game where you are the horror. In CARRION, you play as a disgusting flesh monster who has escaped into the science facility that was previously studying you. As you progress through the game, eating every soldier and scientist in sight, you grow and spread your biomass while wrecking everything around you. It's a cathartic game in a lot of ways, as combat encounters are able to keep a fantastic balance between making you feel like a powerful, unstoppable monster, while not actually being so easy that the game gets boring. The imagery, sound design, and, get ready because this is a word you're going to hear a lot today, atmosphere of CARRION are all masterfully well done, making the doomed facility feel alive and the flesh beast you're controlling feel gross and unpleasant. However, the game is sadly not without its flaws. After a while, combat starts to get a bit one-note, despite the fact that you can find powers like spikes and a body slam. For the most part, almost all of the game's combat boils down to grab thing with tentacle, and people hoping for an evolution on that front may find themselves a bit disappointed. There's also the bigger issue that CARRION is very similar to games in the Metroidvania genre, meaning a lot of it is built around exploring a map that opens up as you gain new abilities. However, the game does not provide any method of looking at a map to figure out where you have or have not been, and many of the environments tend to blend together in terms of appearance. Nevertheless, CARRION is still a fantastic game and one of the more recently released entries on this list, having only come out back in July of 2020. It's also a rather short play. You're likely to hit credits after about 4 or 5 hours, which may be a plus or minus for you depending on what you're looking for. If you're not looking to be scared, but are instead looking to be the scare, CARRION is definitely a game you should be checking out immediately. I always find it incredibly interesting when horror games show me what a culture I'm less familiar with finds scary. As many of the games we play are either of Japanese or American origin, many of the monsters they tend to use have become familiar to us, which can unfortunately disarm their ability to scare us a little bit. The most interesting scenarios come from places like Northern Europe, or, in the case of Detention, East Asia, specifically Taiwan. Detention puts players in control of a young woman named Feng Shin, who awakens to find herself in her seemingly abandoned high school during a typhoon. Detention is easily one of my favorite games on this list for multiple reasons. For one, it actually takes place in a real era of Taiwanese history known as the White Terror, a period of martial law that stretched 38 years from 1949 to 1987, which is a part of world history that I had not previously been aware of. Its art style is also incredibly distinct, with a black and white, almost pen and paper aesthetic that makes the presence of blood or other colored objects pop in a very satisfying way. While the game never provides a substantial challenge, with its monsters being rather easy to avoid and its puzzles never reaching into the realm of being too abstract, Detention really shines in its setting and atmosphere that really feel fresh if you've been playing horror games for a long time. If I had to give it one small criticism, its English translation can be a bit rough at times, though it's never an actual hindrance to the game itself, and I never actually had any issues understanding what they meant to say. Otherwise, Detention is absolutely a game you should check out if you not only want to be frightened, but also want to learn a bit of another country's problematic history along the way. Sadly, we'll likely never see another game by the developer of Detention, Red Candle, as they were largely wiped off the map following a controversy having to do with their follow-up game Devotion, allegedly poking fun at the Chinese government and being slammed, censored, and ultimately delisted as a result. At the end of the day, there's just nothing scarier than an empty house at night. Infliction is one of the many horror games that take this concept and run with it. And in fact, Infliction might feature one of the smaller houses I've explored in a game of this style. Developed by a solo developer, this game's inspirations are rather easy to see, especially in the very PT-ish graphical style. Make no mistake though, Infliction manages to pull its own unique spin on plenty of things, and even manages to get around some of the usual frustrations that most first-person horror games suffer from. For one, the atmosphere of the house is always tense and stressful. Even once you've gotten used to the single house in which a majority of the game takes place, there's always something changing or someone wandering around to keep you on your toes. Seriously, I'm saying this off script. To get footage for this video, I had to replay the first hour of the game, and even when I knew nothing was going to happen for the first 15 minutes, I was still super anxious and scared the whole time. That's a sign of it's great. Speaking of the monster wandering the halls, the game pulls off multiple tricks to make sure that the instant death of being caught by her is never so constant that you consider quitting in frustration. Some of the smaller events in each playthrough also seem to be randomized in some form, so each time you go through the game you might find the experience to be slightly different in some subtle ways. To be quite honest, when I first played Infliction, I, for some reason, expected it to be pretty bad, but it exceeded my expectations in just about every way. It's not perfect, some of the puzzles get slightly obtuse, and a few of the later environments are a bit unclear as to where you're supposed to go, but I found myself excited to reach the end and see where else the game went. Some of its endgame revelations actually come out of nowhere and give a peek into a super interesting concept that I kinda hope to see more of in the future, and if you like yourself a real good indie horror game, you owe it to yourself to give Infliction a shot. The most recent game on this list, having released just over a month ago, INMOST is a 2D puzzle platformer that switches between 3 stories, each with their own gameplay style. In one, you play as a man in what is almost a mini Metroidvania, collecting items that allow him to traverse to different parts of a small labyrinthian castle. In the next, you play as a little girl who's unhappy with her home life, seemingly rejecting her parents for some unknown reason. In the last one, you play as a knight who must fight through various short combat arenas using his sword and grappling hook. The story changes between these consistently until the ending ties them all together in a rather satisfying manner. INMOST is one of those games that I think might be seen as a slight stretch to categorize it as horror, but I think its bleak and gloomy atmosphere, as well as some of its more anxiety-inducing monster encounters, do let it slot neatly into the season. It's a bit more tame than most of the other entries here, but will likely still manage to suck you in and make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Its art style is also really well done, reminding me slightly of old Game Boy titles with its monochromatic color scheme, though it's obviously way more detailed than anything that handheld could have ever produced. There are a few puzzle solutions that had me baffled and frustrated during my time with INMOST, but over the course of my 4-hour playthrough, it still kept me engaged and wanting to see it through to the end. Not to mention, its ending probably has the most hopeful message of any of the games on this list, which is good if you also find yourself needing a pick-me-up. I'm sure a lot of people need that right now, if we're being honest. If you're going for less scary and more atmospheric and gloomy with the occasional fright, then INMOST is the game for you. In 2010, developer Playdead made a name for themselves with the release of their dark and gloomy puzzle platformer Limbo, but in my opinion, they completely outdid themselves with their follow-up 6 years later, Inside. Just like Limbo, Inside is also a 2D puzzle platformer that puts you in control of a small boy running from some form of military organization and making his way towards something. It's not entirely clear what exactly is happening for a large portion of the game, something done intentionally to keep you guessing as you push on through the countryside of the boy's world. Inside is another game that I would only loosely refer to as horror, being another one of the more horror-adjacent games on this list. While it is rarely a scary game, it is certainly a stressful and at times downright disturbing one in its own right. Its gloomy, faded art style masterfully sets a certain mood, and the sometimes graphic and horrifying deaths that the boy can experience are certain to put a chill down your spine. The way that Inside uses sound design, having almost no soundtrack to speak of, adds to this vibe and makes it the perfect game to play on a rainy October night. While I think some of the later platforming puzzles get a bit frustrating and sometimes hard to wrap your head around, there's no denying that the payoff for almost everything you do in Inside is completely worth it. If you're watching this video, there's a chance you already know what happens in the game's final sequence, but for those who don't, I won't elaborate because it's really something you should play and see for yourself. Trust me, it's worth your time if you haven't given this game a shot. While so-called walking simulators are usually referred to by that name in a derisive manner, it turns out that genre is actually really good for horror. Walking simulators give the ability to create a tightly designed experience very similar to a real-life haunted house, with developers able to plan for exactly where the player will likely be and set up scares accordingly. One of the veterans of this type of horror game is Bloober Team's Layers of Fear, a game with no real challenge to speak of, but a masterfully terrifying experience nonetheless. In Layers of Fear, the player takes control of an artist exploring his large, empty house in search of materials to use for his latest masterpiece. As the game progresses, reality begins to twist and distort around him, playing with the concept of impossible space and changing geometry in some incredibly cool ways. You'll begin to learn more about how he got to this point in his life, and also learn about how his art supplies are a little unconventional, to say the least. Yet another game heavily inspired by PT. For a demo, that game sure did have a lot of influence. Layers of Fear takes things in a different direction than Infliction, creating a casual, friendly trip through a terrifying lens of madness. And there's honestly not much more that needs to be said. If you like scary things and you haven't played Layers of Fear yet, you should probably fix that sometime soon. Our next game, Little Nightmares, feels like it was overlooked by a lot of people upon its initial release because of its perceived similarity to Inside, having released just under a year later. In reality, while the tones are slightly similar, Little Nightmares does quite a bit to differentiate its gameplay and setting from its contemporaries. Little Nightmares is another horror-themed platformer, but this time, instead of being locked to a 2D plane, you have the full range of a 3D environment. You play as a child named Styx, working to escape a ship filled to the brim with disturbing, almost human creatures that want to make you their next meal. Those creatures are, by far, the standout feature of Little Nightmares. With their baggy, ill-fitting skin and terrifying lack of expression, they are sure to send a chill down your spine as you attempt to escape them. There's also the shoe-collecting thing with his long arms and horrible folded flesh. The monster design is just firing on all cylinders in this game. The plot itself is told very vaguely, with a lot of what's happening left up to interpretation by the player, meaning that when you're done playing it, there's a huge amount of content theorizing about it to go digging through afterwards. There are parts of Little Nightmares that I find slightly frustrating, with the nature of its 3D environments sometimes making platforming or avoiding death a tad more frustrating than it really needs to be, but overall it's still well worth your time. Buying it on the Switch also happens to come with all of the game's DLC, including an entire second story starring a new character that you can dive into right away. Not only that, a sequel is on the way, currently set to release in February of next year. There's no better time than now to give this game a shot. Next up is my absolute favorite game on the list. Oxenfree was the debut title of developer Night School, an adventure game that puts you in control of a rebellious teenager named Alex who is taking part in a high school tradition of partying overnight on the nearby Edwards Island. This party unfortunately goes sour when she and her friends wind up accidentally waking up a supernatural force that is intent on escaping the island at any cost. Alex must work together with her friends and her new stepbrother Jonas to thwart those plans while also getting themselves back home. I don't have a lot more to say about Oxenfree, if I'm being quite honest. It's actually one of my favorite games of all time, let alone being my favorite horror game. Oxenfree doesn't rely super hard on jump scares, though there is one occasionally, or even the act of seeing the monster you're up against, instead relying on good old-fashioned atmosphere and masterful sound design to create an experience you will not soon forget. I mean it, if you have a taste for the spooky things in life, you are depriving yourself of a good time by having not played Oxenfree yet. By far one of the most unique entries on this list, Perception is a first-person horror game with an interesting though unrealistic gimmick. In Perception, you play as Cassie Thornton, a woman who has come to explore an abandoned mansion that appears to have some connection to her past. On the surface, it's just another first-person exploration title, much like Infliction, but the key difference is that Cassie is blind. For this reason, you can only see your surroundings based on noise, able to tap Cassie's cane in order to temporarily get a full view of the room using echolocation. The only problem is that the mansion is being haunted by a presence which can locate you via sound if you tap your cane too often. It's because of this central feature that Perception is among the tensest games I've ever played. Turns out that if you can't see your surroundings, it gives designers that much more freedom to surprise or shock you. On paper, I feel like I should hate this mechanic. It's not much different from the terrible flashlight battery mechanics that plague so many bad games of this genre, but the key difference here is that the entire game is designed around the idea that you need to tap your cane to see where you are, and doing so too often may put you in danger. As one would expect from a game built heavily around it, the sound design of this game is impeccable, and the mansion manages to stay surprising while never being confusing to navigate. Unfortunately, one of the later sequences of the game introduces some obstacles that are extremely frustrating to deal with, but overall, Perception is among the top tier of games that are sure to get a jump out of you no matter who you are. Of all the games on this list, I feel like categorizing Thumper as horror is one of the loosest picks, but come on, just look at it. Thumper is a rhythm game where you play as a space beetle who has apparently found itself in a feud with a giant eldritch head. As a beetle, you are able to slam against and fly over various obstacles put in your path by the head and its minions, all to the beat of a truly existentially terrifying soundtrack. There's really not much more to Thumper, if we're being honest. Looking at gameplay and hearing this brief synopsis has essentially told you everything you need to know. It should be pointed out, though, that this is likely the least accessible game on this list. Thumper is hard. It is a crazy difficult game that does not pull its punches and has absolutely no interest in being your friend. It is not mean-spirited about this difficulty, but just know that if you play Thumper, you should be prepared to get your ass thoroughly kicked. Completing this game is an outright accomplishment, and if you can do so, you're better than I am, which is not exactly a high bar, but hey, Even so, Thumper is one of the best and most unique rhythm games I've ever played. If you just want something hard as nails with scary imagery and a wonderfully controlled cacophony of a soundtrack, look no further. Thumper is the game for you. So that's all 10 scary games. But wait! What if you live with or are friends with someone who isn't actually all that interested in being scared? Are you just doomed to never be able to share the Halloween spirit with this beloved individual? Fear not, because I have a bonus recommendation for just this exact purpose. Monster Prom is a multiplayer competitive dating sim where you play as a student at Spooky High, where the Monster Prom is in 3 weeks and you don't have a date. But you don't want just any date, no, you want to take one of the most popular members of the student body, so it's time to get to work. In case you did a double take at my description of the game's genre, let me elaborate. During each turn of Monster Prom, players decide where they are going to spend the day, participating in scenes with the game's cast that will help them not only build their various social stats, but also their rapport with their target love interest. These love interests are the best part of the game, with characters like Polly the Poltergeist, Calculester the Living Computer, Zoe the Eldritch Deity, or my girl Miranda the Mermaid Princess all absolutely stealing the show. The writing is laugh out loud hilarious if your sense of humor matches up with the tone it's trying to put forward, and it's made even better if you play the game with friends while you all give your own voices to each character. It should be noted that Monster Prom is through and through an adult game, with its humor and language being thoroughly unsuitable for young children. Otherwise, if your group is a bunch of adults, I heartily recommend Monster Prom for a night of alcohol and laughter. The game is also incredibly inclusive, allowing you to pick your pronouns at the start and letting anybody pursue any love interest regardless of who they're playing as. It's a wonderfully good time that I don't think gets as much attention as it deserves, and I consider the fact that it's on Switch to be nothing short of a wonderful miracle. And that does it. I hope this list has helped you set down some plans for a cozy Halloween night of scares and frights. If any of these games caught your eye and you decide to give them a shot, let us know in the comments. I absolutely want to know what you think of my recommendations. Also, let me know if you have any horror games available on Switch that you think I should look into. I'm always itching to try a new spooky experience. We have more Halloween-themed features planned to come out throughout the month of October, so keep an eye on our Twitter over at Nintendo_NWR to see when those drop. And you can also check out our Twitch channel to watch us stream some scary games to get into the right seasonal mood. Happy Halloween!